Speaker is Dr. Phil Wilkinson. Thank you so much, Phil, for joining us and agreeing to share your work with us. Phil is a colleague at Bournemouth University, where he is a principal academic in communications. And he's also been involved in a number of very interesting and innovative research projects over recent years, often working in a kind of embedded way as a researcher in residence. Originally on a project funded by Samsung on the island of Portland, and then various projects in health, information health communication contexts, and also working around digital skills, often in family contexts as well. Currently, Phil is working as a researcher in residence at a digital skills hub in Boscombe, UK, which for our external guests, Boscombe is part of Bournemouth or close to Bournemouth. And this work intersects with a number of national policy agendas. So it's fantastic that Phil's with us today to share his research. I'm now going to ask you to share and hand you the Zoom floor. As always, please post any questions in the chat as we go. Thanks, Phil. Over to you.
Thank you for the introduction. Hello, everybody. Yes. So I'm going to be talking today about my research project, working as a researcher in residence in a digital skills hub in Boscombe. I'm going to unpack what all that stuff means in a second. A bit of background about myself and I always feel I need to kind of justify why I'm the person speaking. So my background is actually computer science. So I have a fairly technical background, which becomes kind of slightly relevant later. And I completed a professional doctorate in digital media at Boscombe University, graduated a little while ago. Initially looking at developing technology for educational purposes before transitioning into realizing it's much more complicated, and we have all these expectations and values and attitudes towards technology that kind of gets in the way. And at the moment, I'm kind of researching the social construction of technology. So again, the expectations, attitudes, ideas we have around technology, because I think that is much more impactful than the technology itself in many ways, and also how we teach about and through technology generally. So as Julie mentioned, I'm a researcher in residence, which is a title I kind of made up, working in a digital skills hub in Boscombe, which I'll talk more about Boscombe later. But the digital skills hub was founded in August 2 years ago to serve the needs of by various different measures, deprived community, to support in terms of digital skills delivery for residents and businesses. From my perspective, I wanted to be helping and supporting that because I think it's important, but also as a researcher, so as an educator, I thought it was important. As a researcher, I found it really interesting to kind of use this as a case study to experience, all these kind of bigger issues we have around the digital skills gap and digital divide and digital inclusion and so on, and seeing how all these different things actually start to manifest in practice. So very, very generally, I'm kind of exploring this digital skills gap in all these kind of related terms. So yeah, as Julie mentioned, some of my previous research has kind of informed this. So previously I did another embedded research project on this very kind of isolated community in Portland. The project kind of loosely around digital families, this idea of getting families to co-engage or co-create technology. And similar to what we'll see in this project, it was a collaborative effort, an interconnected effort between all these different kind of social service providers and educators. But moving on. So the wider context, it's complicated. If I'm being honest, this presentation is probably going to be quite loose and scattered because that's the nature of this kind of research. And if anything, me kind of doing this presentation is helpful for me understanding actually what is going on here, what can we extrapolate from this, what can we take away from this, and what can we start, using some findings, because it's complicated. It is if we look at the digital skills gap and what contributes to it, it's people, it's places, it's policies from a national or local perspective, and how that changes with different governments over time. It's about processes for applying for funding. It's about the actual pedagogy as well. So in a classroom context, how do you actually teach digital skills or digital literacy or digital competency, or how do we frame this? And also in almost like a practical perspective, how do we promote these things? We have these initiatives available, but how do we promote it, present it in a way that is actually going to be engaging, appealing to communities that we, by definition, are kind of excluded or disadvantaged or not always that engaged with social services. So what I'm going to be doing is talking about some of the stuff that that is taking place in Digital Skills Hub and how this kind of connects to these kind of wider, bigger discussions. If I am speaking too quickly and too mumbly, let me know in the chat because I have an issue doing that. So generally the digital divide, what I'm interested in is kind of critically evaluating the different factors that contribute to this digital divide using kind of examples nationally and internationally, just effectively trying to see what this looks like in practice and how this manifests in practice. I'm going to come back to this idea of critically throughout because I find it really difficult to be critical without being conspiratorial in terms of the kind of the wider structures in place and the number of organizations that are involved in this. Signposting that. So effectively, as well as defining the digital divide, I'm interested in, like, who gets to define and measure this divide, because that is a political decision that has impact. Who is working to address this, decide in what way? Where does this digital divide come? What other divisions or digital divide does this digital divide intersect with? So it's important to know that the digital divide has been understood, constructed, defined in multiple different ways, and is, with increasingly kind of like granular, refined focuses. Traditionally, it was just focused on like, material access, and then it was internet access, and then it's like, data quality, and like, now it's about kind of skills and competence, and that kind of thing. And again, it's related to other terms like digital poverty, digital exclusion, as well as digital skills and digital literacy. But it's a fairly sort of historical issue. It's not necessarily a new thing. But yeah, when we talk about the digital divide, we're talking about the impacts that come from having different levels of access to digital communication technologies very broadly. So we talk about economic activity and productivity. So for people who are out of work and need to get into work, even just accessing work opportunities requires a level of digital skills or digital capability. There's also a lot of kind of focus on people who are currently in employment, and this idea of the hidden middle, people who are digitally skilled enough to be employable, but not necessarily digital skilled enough to kind of like progress in their place of employment or to be productive in that context from the organization perspective. It also relates to socio-civic participation, so including access to civic services. So parents being able to support their children effectively requires some kind of digital knowledge, because there's a lot of kind of like homework delivery engagement online, and COVID really brought that to the forefront. But even things like accessing universal credit or the job center, or these kind of, I would say, like baseline level social services require baseline level digital literacy as well. And also just socio-cultural participation. So staying connected with friends, families, that kind of thing. And again, there's multiple factors that contribute to this. So material circumstances, the socio-civic circumstances. So if they have limited educational experiences, if they're not confident in educational contexts generally, are they going to be confident in are they going to be confident in accessing their digital education opportunities as well? And also political circumstances. So the movement towards kind of digital by default in terms of socio-civic services, and kind of resource constraints, which mean digital access points become necessities for resource saving rather than thinking in terms of inclusivity, accessibility. So there's a lot of research around the kind of digital skills gap, digital divide, however we might want to construct this as well. So this is from the Good Things Foundation from 2021, so probably a little bit dated maybe now, but still pretty holds true. I mean, again, we can understand why, so we can understand the reasons why people might be divided and the impacts of that in multiple different ways. What I find interesting to think about when we talk about the digital divide, because the term the digital divide itself almost implies this like technological determinism where this divide just appeared and it's digital, right? And technology is the cause of this, or the root cause of this, or the sole cause of this. But there was a concerted effort 10 years ago to move to digital by default, which was justified in the policy documents around resource savings, efficiency savings, and also accessibility, which is now ironic considering the amount of work around digital exclusion and digital inclusion. So when we talk about the digital divide as a term, I think this kind of like socio-political decision-making behind the scenes sometimes gets lost in that as well. And we think it's just a thing that's happened rather than something that to a large degree was kind of, man-made. So again, from Digital Data Poverty Alliance, we can look at digital poverty in context, and it's kind of increased movement towards that as well. So again, it's not just about people not having access to technology, it's and giving them kind of access, or giving them devices. It's are they in a socioeconomic position or effective position to make the most of those opportunities? Rambling a bit. And again, there's additional research around, material access and what that looks like. So from physical access to technology, to access to the internet, to stable internet connections, to consistent and stable internet connections, to internet access on appropriate devices. So some people might actually have internet access, and that would be captured in some metric somewhere, but the internet access might be very, very low, low speeds, or with significant data caps, or they can only access the internet on mobile devices, which is quite limiting for a lot of online activities they could be participating in. And again, as we can recognize, digital exclusion is, overlaps with other forms of exclusion. So it's quite rare, I think, to say that somebody is just digitally excluded. They're typically excluded in a much kind of broader way. So from the kind of digital skills hub perspective, and some of the work that's taking place there that kind of illustrates this, is even though it's called a digital skills hub and that's its remit, like it can't just be about digital inclusion and digital skills activity, because that's not how people experience digital exclusion. So on a Tuesday, they have this event called Community Connect, where they have these different services providers available for people to come in and access. So on the surface, this doesn't really look like it's anything to do with digital skills or digital inclusion. However, it's a necessity from this place-based approach to community development, engaging local service providers and partners to be working together, to be seen as a hub, a community hub generally, or more broadly, rather than just a digital skills hub. And what we're finding, or I find quite interesting from this, is the kind of questions that people come in to ask these service providers, whether it's in this digital skills hub or elsewhere, they often are framed around kind of digital support, tech support questions. So when somebody's asking about, say, for the job centre, how to upload their CV, that's not really job centre to a specific question. That's more like a technical question that these service providers are having to field. So I think it almost makes this idea of the digital skills gap and supporting this digital skills gap is like distributed liability, or this distributed responsibility. While these different service providers are effectively having to provide technical support or digital support, but we don't necessarily recognize it as such because it's seen as part of their other support in this broader way. So digital skills, on that note, seen as important for a bunch of different reasons. Again, as mentioned, economic activity, socio-civic participation, and socio-cultural participation, or staying engaged. And again, we've recognized that this digital skills crisis for a while now. But what we actually mean by digital skills and digital literacy, so digital skills is quite, I would say, contested, or should be more contested, I think, in my perspective, seeing how this kind of manifests in practice. Because we can relate some of these issues about digital skills and how we construct it and how we define it and how we mobilize it in terms of these, digital inclusion initiatives to kind of historic questions around digital literacy, about the agents behind it, the organizations behind it, the entities behind it that get to determine what kind of literacy is valued over other kinds of literacy, or what kind of skills valued over other kinds of literacy, other kinds of skills, are enacting kind of like ideological decision making here. Okay. So what we see in the essential digital skills, for instance, and how we talk about digital skills generally, I think, or what kind of funding is available. This is a bit kind of anecdotal from my perspective. There's a kind of a key priority of the kind of economic imperative of digital skills. So again, it's about employability, it's about workforce productivity, it's about getting people who are not employed or underemployed into employment. That's the kind of like the dominant frame of reference. Again, not saying it's the only frame of reference, but that is the dominant frame of reference. And again, this is where I'm trying to be critical without sounding conspiratorial, but just to illustrate why one of these factors that needs to be considered. So currently we have the Essential Digital Skills Framework. It's on version 2 as of 2022, I think. It was developed in 2018 with significant commercial involvement to come up with essential digital skills, foundation digital skills. This is what we mean by that. This is a baseline thing that everyone should be able to do. And this is kind of under the custodian of Lloyds Bank. So the development of essential digital skills was through consultation and coordinated by Lloyds Banking Group and the tech partnership, signpost to there in a second, and overseen by a steering group which kind of include these representatives. So government representatives, some charities, but also some kind of commercial organizations as well. So what I find interesting about this is the reason that kind of Lloyds are now in charge for this, and they are custodians of this. And I'm using the term custodians because that's how the UK government framed it in one of their press releases about Lloyds' role here. They do see them as custodians, or the previous government did see them as custodians. Yeah, that's it. Of this framework is they were given responsibility for this because they run the Digital Consumer Index, which is this national survey that looks at digital consumption activities, and that kind of like translated or morphed into this broader look at digital inclusion or measures of digital exclusion or measures of digital skills, or whether people have essential digital skills. And if we trace the provenance of this back as far as we can to 2015, there was the basic digital skills in 2015. And what we can see over time is this kind of like, what's the word? Not a hot potato, but a kind of passing along of responsibility for this thing between various different organizations, with a kind of high level of involvement from kind of commercial organizations and commercial providers, in kind of partnership with charities as well as kind of government organizations. What I think is really interesting is, is in 2022, there is the Essential Digital Skills Framework 2 was released. Again, if you read through the documentation, the onus for developing this new framework isn't necessarily clear, nor is the process and the consultation process that was utilized clear. Because on the surface reading, it looks like Lloyds just decided that we needed to update this framework, and then they kind of activated this advisory group, and then they started, launched this new framework where they made some tweaks to it. Where in the kind of previous development of it in 2018, there was a lot, a documentation around like consultation and people submitting their evidence and kind of like contributing to this, to informing this process. And again, this is where critical sounds a bit conspiratorial. I'm not saying there's anything kind of negative happening here. I think it just illustrates this kind of like this mishmash, what's the word? Like kind of fragmented, often kind of commercially driven oversight of something that by definition is seen as essential or very important. And to my mind, the thing that kind of gives me pause about this is thinking in terms of other things we also see as essential, like literacy or numeracy skills. That's not something we're necessarily kind of outsourcing or giving custodianship of to commercial providers to develop the frameworks for or to measure. So when we talk about digital skills delivery, these framings of digital skills delivery have an impact because they determine what kind of initiatives are funded and how these initiatives are evaluated. Just taking a step back to talk about the hub in a bit more detail in the context of Boscombe. So we know from research now that if you want to have effective interventions, it's all about effectively meeting people where they currently are. So conducting by local trusted organizations close to the everyday lives of the people that we're aiming to help. So slightly controversially, this is what the front of the Digital Skills Hub used to look like. It's part of this kind of wider initiative funded by the Towns Fund from the previous government. And as part of this kind of wider initiative around kind of this idea of better Boscombe. So this is the kind of the storefront, effectively, the space we're trying to invite people to. What we found quite quickly, though, is this idea of better Boscombe is not necessarily that well received by the Boscombe community. To my mind, I think it's because there's an implied better yourself Boscombe, or slightly kind of like self-elevated, well-to-do. We just want to help you, but this kind of implication of deficiency by default as a starting point for any kind of relationship going forward. It's interesting because I had a similar kind of conversation when I was working with Samsung, where they wanted to also develop a community space that kind of focused on digital skills. And they're quite keen to call it the digital classroom. I tried to push back against that because not many people actually want to go to classrooms. And also for the kind of people that we're choosing to target, they would probably likely have had a negative experience of education and classrooms. So it feels almost kind of like pedantic to be kind of looking at these specific words, but these have a significant impact in terms of how we promote and communicate these things. So Boscombe itself, I don't know if people are familiar with Boscombe. I love Boscombe. It is a very unique place. It has a very clear sense of its own identity, but its own sense of identity is kind of largely informed by people looking down upon or judging Boscombe. If you mention Boscombe to anybody who's in the area, they will look at you like, are you safe? Are you okay? Are you going to get jumped by somebody who's addicted to drugs? It has this kind of very negative self-perception, which the people of Boscombe are aware of. At the same time, there's this kind of very interesting, I say counterculture, slightly rebellious, very kind of creative, like pre-gentrification spirit or energy or kind of attitude or identity to the place there as well. So these pictures, for instance, are taken from a Boscombe Instagram account. And I think these kind of images kind of really, just the fact that this Instagram account exists and the kind of images it puts out to represent Boscombe, I think is quite illustrative of Boscombe. It's a very unpretentious place. It knows it has an edge and it knows it's a bit rough around the edges. It doesn't hide that, it embraces that. So what we've had to do in terms of this digital skills outreach is actually kind of do this like, much bigger piece around how do we engage Boscombe, how do we match Boscombe, how do we build trust, how do we build authenticity with this community that historically has been kind of looked down upon and treated with this kind of sense of deficiency. Hence, we have this kind of We Are Boscombe campaign where we want to kind of embrace and engage with and celebrate Boscombe for all of its roughness and rough edges as our starting point, and then translate that into people to actually engage with these more like functional interventionist activities we're doing around digital skills and digital inclusion. Part of that as well is being kind of as personal as possible. So my face is in a lot of the social media, which I hate and makes me very uncomfortable, but that's part of it now as well. So we're quite active on social media for these reasons. We can go back to that in a second. So that's trying to get people through the front door to actually engage with the digital skills kind of courses and initiatives that we're running. What we found is that there's a range of different digital inclusion initiatives funded, delivered, and evaluated through a fragmented network of governmental, commercial, charitable organizations. I guess it's a catch-22 situation. There's a lot of organizations who are interested in this area, which is good. It also means there's a lot of organizations interested in this area. So it leads to this kind of slightly fragmented, internally competitive thing that takes place. Critically from this, though, we can see that evaluative approaches and priorities within this network typically prioritize a reductive understanding of the digital good or digital skills that can come from digital inclusion. And part of that is just the need to kind of assess and evaluate things at scale, which kind of leads to use of kind of metrics and quantifiables, which is inherently quite reductive. Funding streams that are available are typically highly targeted and again usually prioritize economic imperatives around digital skills shortages, which again kind of comes with this on like caveats over what kind of skills training and delivery and support is available. And funding streams sometimes are offered competitively, typically around short timescales or single cohorts. So kind of like initial bursts of kind of capital investment to run some workshops or run a series of workshops. And it kind of creates a situation where like actually there's something that's happening here that's really, really effective and we know it works, but the funding has died down. So we have to stop that. And then another funding stream becomes available, but with a slightly different requirements behind it. So it's a case like having good practice, but having to reinvent it or reframe it or redevelop it and then re-justify it constantly for accessing these kind of funding streams. It also kind of incentivizes this need to kind of perform good impact. Again, I'm not saying all work taking place is negative, but it kind of creates this incentive performing. We are doing good interventionist stuff here. But it's short term, so the actual long-term implications or impact of this is hard to evaluate or identify. And a little bit more perversely, it kind of creates this incentive structure that benefits organizations that are good at bidding rather than delivery. So, for instance, not going to name names, within the kind of digital skills hub and the kind of the community service providers I'm working with, there is some known organizations that are known to have very well established internal processes for bidding for contracts winning those contracts and then effectively hiring tutors on 0-hour contracts to do the delivery. But their whole like organizational structure is about just getting the income in, and the delivery is less of a factor. So this space has only been running for a year and a half in terms of delivering digital skills courses, but in that time, these are the service providers that have come into this space and actually delivered these courses. We've had Skills and Learning, several charities, including International Care Network, who work specifically with asylum seekers or refugees. We have National Career Service and City Tech. We have Silicon South and Evolve, which kind of do business support and business delivery as well. So this kind of hub, this digital skills hub, is very much becoming a hub, like this kind of central kind of connective point for all these different service providers, all ostensibly trying to do the same thing around digital skills delivery. But I just think it's interesting to reflect back on the fact that the space has not been running that long, but we have had so many different service providers coming through the door with different pots of funding available to do good work. And again, this is just for courses and digital skills courses, as drop-in events, one-off events, the community connect things like Tuesday, other activities. There's a whole bunch of other service providers that we're working with as well. From a pedagogic perspective, which I find really interesting, start unpacking, because there's this tension here between if we have funding, we can deliver a digital skills course. How do we structure that? How do we frame that? And how do we teach this? So there are, based off the essential digital skills framework, there's the essential digital skills qualification, which is qualification that's fully funded and available for free for adults who want to develop their essential digital skills, assuming that they can demonstrate some kind of economic disadvantage. This has been kind of running for a few years now, but the Department of Education has identified that the take-up of this course is actually quite low. I'm not sure if how low if it's public information, but low. Because something like this, as an example from Skills and Learning, who does adult education, for digital functional skills, that is a 19-week course at 3 hours a week, which is a huge time commitment to do something which is seen as essential. So it's a very, very significant time commitment for kind of developing these skills. The other thing, again, this is anecdotal or speculative on my end, but I think that we need to be kind of cautious about how we frame these things. So if you start talking about essential or functional or basic, there's the implication for the learners that you are missing something that's basic and essential or functional. So again, this idea of deficiency by default, implications of deficiency, I think is something that we need to be very, very conscious of. So what I'm finding for people actually kind of coming into and engaging the space is, the questions, motivations, desires, goals that people have to learn digital skills don't always line up with what is offered, both in terms of pedagogic practice and how we promote them. So for instance, we can talk about essential digital skills in this very kind of vague, abstracted, decontextualized way, where people recognize this skill in terms of something that they would like benefit from knowing in practice. So for example, I teach a lot of Excel for data processing. Nobody wants to learn Excel, but people want to learn how to manage the household finances or create charts, so they learn Excel. But nobody goes out of their way to learn Excel. They have this other specific need they're trying to address, and digital skills becomes a conduit for that, or the barrier for that. I think individual perceptions of the skills gap, this kind of self-identified learning need, kind of exists in kind of two perspectives. This kind of general perspective, which is much more pervasive and insidious to my mind, and much more specific. So generally, there's this kind of self-perception of being broadly digitally deficient. And this is why I think we need to be very conscious of that. Typically framed with this kind of binary understanding of their own self-efficacy. So things like, I'm not a computer person, in this kind of absolutist, concrete way, whether it's you are or you aren't. It's not a case of learning something or improving. It's like you are not. And specific ways. So, they have a confrontation with some kind of digital competence gap or confidence gap that acts as a barrier to some goal. And that's when they typically come to us. So that kind of specific identification of the digital skills gap is typically the motivating point for when people start to reach out for us, the Digital Skills Hub. And then it becomes a case of like, okay, can we translate that or map that or make that fit with the kind of courses and pedagogic practices that we're running? But if somebody's coming to us with this kind of very, very specific skills need that they want to address, signposting them to a longer form course becomes a bigger ask or a bigger commitment. The big thing that I'm thinking a lot about now is this idea of developing digital resilience. And I kind of recognize I'm approaching digital technology and competence from this kind of privileged position, so bear with me. So for members of the public, not knowing how to do something with technology or something unexpected happening kind of reinforces this tech anxiety or this self-perception they have about digital inadequacy. So we can teach them by rote as soon as a pop-up message comes up, or as soon as an error is thrown, or as soon as Microsoft updates or Facebook updates its website so it looks slightly different. That can be really, really kind of throwing for somebody who lacks digital competency. What I find kind of interesting is like not knowing how to do something with technology is my natural state of being. People come to me and they ask me questions about technology and saying, I have no idea because there's too much technology out there and it changes all the time. So if somebody asks me, how can I change this thing on my phone? Or for instance, somebody had a Google page set up for their business and they wanted to know how to change their email for that. I have no idea. I've never used that before. So it's just a case of kind of engaging with technology as an exercise in continuous problem solving, or for me trying to kind of model this idea of like, hey, I don't know how to do this, but this is how I'm going to work it out, and modeling that, because I think that's the thing we need to be focusing on, because technology does change. Things have updated, new technology becomes available. So I think this idea of this digital resilience kind of refers to this idea of being self-directed with their engagement with technology. Again, anybody who is technical or works in a high-tech profession, if you ask them what they do most of the day, they will tell you that they Google, and like that's their biggest like technical competency. But I think also kind of doing this digital resilience, focus on digital resilience, can help people resist this kind of broad narrative that is kind of pervasive now about technology, that elevates certain perspectives of its significance whilst undermining their self-efficacy. So for instance, I do drop-in support for businesses around digital communications, and you have a lot of businesses coming in saying that they know they need to be on social media. They don't know about social media, they don't know what it is or how to use it or why, but they just know that they need to be on social media because all the messaging they received is like social media is critically important for all businesses all the time. And most of the time the conversation becomes, okay, so you probably don't need to be on social media wholesale, you need to be on this thing specifically. So it's taking this kind of amorphous, overwhelming idea and breaking it down to something more tangible. The reason I think this is quite insidious, though, is because of this, elevated expectations of how we should be engaging with technology, whilst in parallel undermining people's self-efficacy to engage with technology makes people actually quite vulnerable. So there are a lot of organizations out there now providing training and workshops and these kind of things in these areas which are seen as like highly important and highly critical, where people see themselves as lacking digital competencies, and doing so for a fairly high price point, and actually delivering stuff that, from my perspective, I don't think is actually that helpful or useful for people. But anyway, like I said, I'm getting speculative. So again, to assist with this, and this is a bit self-promoting-y now, because I think the way we talk about technology and this kind of broader general issue that exists in terms of people's self-efficacy is something that's kind of going to be hard to address. So as a new initiative, I'm running what's called Tech Talks, and kind of leveraging myself in this kind of like self-aggrandizing way as the academic expert who can help people feel comfortable with technology. Where we're kind of looking to change how people talk about technology to take common concerns or common questions that people have. It's like, okay, let's actually unpack this and engage with this and be more critical of this and feel more grounded about this and feel safer, more comfortable, confident talking about these kind of things. I also think there is a kind of broader digital capability gap. So I think there's a lot of discussion, a lot of focus on like the learners themselves or the people who are digitally excluded, but quite frequently we're finding that there's just a lack of provision or resourcing or ability to find people who can actually teach and support and coach people in this area, which kind of makes sense. There is this digital skills shortage generally, and that applies to educators, community outreach practitioners as well. compounding that is the fact that these educators and community outreach practitioners are typically, overworked and under-resourced to begin with. And there is, this kind of trend or this utilization of volunteers, which kind of leads to inconsistent provision in terms of level and frequency of support available. Okay. And that was it as a kind of rambly 35-minute thing. Hope there's some stuff useful in there. Happy to take any questions or points of clarification if anybody has it.
Thanks, Phil. It's amazing. There aren't any questions or comments in the chat yet, so I'm going to invite people to either take a minute to reflect and then use the chat to post them, or you can just raise your Zoom hand or just appear in the screen and start talking, whatever you'd like to do. But while you do that, I'm going to ask a question if Phil doesn't mind, which is, I really agree with you, about everything actually, but particularly the point you made about small scale funding, lack of time. And I think, I'm trying not to put words in your mouth, but I think you said, what did you say? That I've written down what I think, which is about confirmation bias. You are performative, but people are in a kind of performance of positivity in the middle of the project. And so my question is about, we know that can lead to a kind of confirmation bias because you're wanting the next lot of funding and the funder wants results. And I think we also know what the ideal outcome is more funding, longer, more time, more scale, and also room for complexity. But I wonder if you have any advice, because you're obviously having some successes at doing this, at managing to operate with research integrity and be viable for funding at the same time. Like, what are you managing to do to kind of manage that tension in your own work? Sorry, massively long question, but I needed to work it out as I was going.
Yeah, no, and you also kind of drop research integrity in there, which is like, am I acting with a sense of research integrity? Maybe. No, I think it is tricky. I think the Digital Skills Hub itself as an organization is almost like it's the conduit. It enables these kind of other kinds of activities to take place. So from their perspective, there's less of a concern of this kind of need to perform. Having said that, though, the Digital Skills Hub itself has these kind of KPIs that it needs to hit. What I find interesting is like talking about KPIs with all these other service providers. There's this kind of general sense of like, we know what these are for. We know that these are kind of like political instruments that we need to satisfy and make look good. And at the same time, there's like this kind of negotiation of like, well, we need to be performing it in this way, but with this still the sense of integrity over, but we are also delivering on the outcomes that these things are intended to capture. So it's almost like this operationalization, or like putting these kind of like these KPIs, these evaluative measures into practice, is where it's kind of like on the entities, the organizations, the practitioners, integrity to do so, I suppose. But like I said, there's an issue where, because they're quite reductive measures, and there's a kind of classic thing of any kind of, as soon as a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure in any kind of capacity. There is this kind of incentivization for like being really, really good at performing those measures, which some organizations can take advantage of. So I don't think there really is a good answer, and I'm reluctant to say that I'm navigating it or we're navigating it well, because I don't think any organization could be. Because the trade-off is, the counter to that is like, we just don't have any kind of evaluative measures, or we only do long-form research and long-form in-depth studies that are hard to kind of like look at scale, or hard to kind of scale up.
Yeah, no. We could go on. We could talk about it for hours, but that would be unfair on the people who want to ask questions. So thank you very much for that answer. Now I've got a couple more in the chat. One is you, Lynn, who says, thank you for your talk. And the question is, funders usually want academics or proposers to address inequality, deprived areas, or underrepresented groups. What's your suggestions for working with these groups without stigmatizing them or putting them down?
I think it kind of like boils down to like kind of participatory research methods, which itself can also be, there's degrees of participation and performing participation. But I think it's kind of like taking that kind of bottom-up approach as much as you are able to, and identifying with these communities, what kind of activities, what kind of skills, goals, aims that they have. I think the big thing that kind of informs my approach here is the kind of work that I actually do with Julian, fully enough, on this idea of capability, or the capability approach, which is also all about defining what do people want to be able to be and do, and defining that in ways that are meaningful to them, rather than imposing that from the top down, or imposing that indirectly, and then identifying from that, what kind of resources do they need to be able to have access to achieve those goals. Having said that, though, there typically needs to be this kind of, again, like this negotiation or this translation of, well, these are what these people want to be able to do. These are kind of how they experience exclusion. This is how the funding or the kind of wider structures, such as they are, define, frame exclusion. Can we start mapping these things together?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great answer. I agree. There's also, of course, the kind of elephant in the room now of, the framing of most projects is around a kind of social justice inclusion agenda. And then we can't necessarily rely on people wanting to utilize capability for things that we would think of as being kind of socially virtuous, particularly in the current political moment. So there's always that as well. But sorry, a great question from Judith as well, who's asking on your perspective on added difficulties for older people and the possibility of being left behind, in inverted commas. So have you got any experience or suggestions for working with that demographic?
I do. It's nice because I've got a really interesting example that kind of speaks to the previous question, the previous point as well, in terms of what do people actually want to be able to do with technology. So I have a kind of a frequent visitor now who is an older gay gentleman who came in initially thinking like, I want to be able to engage with technology. And it took me a while to ask him like, yeah, but what do you want to be able to do with that? Because I can show you general skills. Here's Google Maps, here's Facebook, whatever, but what would you actually like to achieve? And he is quite legitimately looking for companionship and how to find other older gay gentlemen in the area that he can form relationships with. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, depending on how this gets framed, this is going to be like a Daily Mail headline. Having said that, though, like that is a legitimate use. That is what that person wanted to do. But like, can we be able to map that to existing measures, how we prioritize digital inclusion? I think in terms of working with older generations generally, I find that the older generation, I think they the most suffer from this kind of self-perception, self-efficacy issue. I think the degree to which there is actually a generational gap needs to be kind of questioned significantly. And again, I'm not saying that there isn't, but I think we can need to kind of avoid assumptions around they're older, therefore they will struggle more than somebody who is younger. But I think, and again, in terms of digital exclusion being kind of mapped to other forms of exclusion as well, I think for the older generation who are also kind of excluded and isolated, this becomes a kind of a bigger issue because it makes it harder for them to reach out. I hope I answered that question. Yes, I think your hand is up.
Yeah, Judith, please.
Hello, it's just me. Yeah, I think it's quite important to recognise that a lot of older people are digitally literate and do use digital means for communication, for services and for civic activities and so on. I think mainly it's around those more marginalised subgroups of older people, if you like. You've mentioned LGBT plus people who may be quite persecuted on the internet in lots of different ways. The older people with learning disabilities, people in poverty, people with dementia. I think it's important to focus on as much on those more marginalised older people than thinking about older people as a general category. But yeah, I would agree that the issue of thinking about generations is perhaps less important than thinking about those much more marginalised older people who do get left behind in lots of ways through the lots of layers of exclusion that they face, and digital exclusion is probably one of them.
Exactly, yeah. I think for it's less about kind of their age and more just like the amount of time they might have spent feeling digitally excluded. Because I think for a lot of the people that kind of come in, they don't really understand for lack of a better point, like the things that they're missing out on. They might have this kind of general sense of like, hey, the internet exists or mobile phones exist, and apparently there's some really cool, exciting things I can do. But they don't have like an initial kind of frame of reference, or much more kind of dated frame of reference or limited frame of reference to understand actually, but these are all these things that you can do now. And again, this is why I kind of like sometimes struggle with this gentleman I was just talking about, because he came in like he knew he was excluded, or he saw himself as excluded. He wanted to learn technology, but without any kind of real specific goal in mind. Because for him, he didn't really have a clear sense of actually what could he do with this, beyond just answering phone calls. So being able to actually, so he is this brave new world that he can start engaging with was actually quite exciting and quite useful. But yeah, I think it's like people recognizing or understanding or having more specificity and more alignment with their own kind of goals and values over the ways in which they are actually excluded and how they can benefit from learning more about technology. Yes.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? I think we've covered everything that's been posted, or everybody that's hang on. Digital, I don't know if it makes sense to say there are different approaches in running digital outreach. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, that, because a lot of the funding is for areas where there seems to be an exclusion problem or a capability deficit. The question's about, whether there are different approaches for running digital outreach in more affluent areas. I'm not sure if there's an explicit intention around that, but do you have any thoughts?
I think speculatively, I think the way the digital delivery gets framed, it becomes less about this interventionist upskilling because you're going to be left behind, you're deficient, to this more like aspirational, make the most, get yourself workforce ready for the 21st century. Here's some added value activities you can do. So kind of the type of activities that are being kind of offered become less about like interventionist and more about capacity building, aspirational. I find. That's my part. And I think there are digital outreach activities, but some of that is quite there are kind of coding clubs that are available, but they're quite limited for free to access. But there are kind of coding clubs that you can pay a fairly significant amount of money for, as a if that's something that you want to be able to access.
Thank you. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I've got a slight lag on my Wi-Fi myself today. Can I invite any other questions or comments, or anyone else want to share any work of their own that's related to the themes Phil's raised today? Okay, in that case, could I just ask you what's next? What are you working on? Do you have any future developments in the pipeline?
I think I'm really interested in this idea of digital resilience and how do we actually develop teaching, training, education materials around that. And this kind of issue of like, how do we translate the kind of support that can be available to the ways in which the digitally excluded would be kind of understanding and framing and seeing their digital exclusion. Because I think that's going to be kind of one of the key things. Like we are offering a lot of support, and support is available. People don't necessarily kind of see that as something that they can access or something that's kind of relevant to them.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. And if one final thing, on a much bigger. Sorry, yeah. I really want to change how we talk about technology, because I think the way we talk about technology is probably the biggest impact on society than the technology itself. I think AI is a really good example of that, because we just spent the past 2 years freaking out about AI and getting overly hyped and excited about AI. and significant amount of money and investment and activities taking place because of this. And now we're starting to realize or come to terms with, okay, so what does this actually look like in practice? So I think that's my big thing, just like actually trying to change this much bigger piece.
Yeah, I think that's also a factor in the way that the funding works, because it means that the field of digital literacy or media literacy, once it gets to a kind of state of maturation where enough people are working on something to start to provide a kind of empirical body of research evidence, the landscape moves on so fast because of text, and then it becomes about AI, and it's trying to convince people that it's the same dynamic. It's the kind of digital engagement, digital literacy capability piece is the same dynamic, but instead we then move into kind of AI literacy as though we're kind of moving away from what we've been doing. But yeah, you don't need me to tell you that. Do we have another hand or question? I can't quite say. I've managed to chair this session from all over the world in recent weeks. I've come back to the UK and my Wi-Fi is running really slow. Sorry for accidentally interrupting the whole time. I can't see anything else, so I'll just ask one more time. Any more questions or comments? And if not, I'm just going to say thanks so much, and I'm going to stop the recording now.
I'll still share.
So yeah, thanks, Phil, so much for giving